Good evening. It's 7 o'clock. Oh, Jill's just clicking in. Jill, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Hey, Jill, how are you this evening?
I'm fine. Yourself?
I'm great. I was
Good.
just getting ready to do my introduction. This is Dale Lamb, Mels 603, Fall 16. Jill has joined me. Um, Jill, I sent out a video that I did with my clinical interns last night. Did you get a chance to look at that?
I have not. I saw the email about it, but I haven't watched it
That's
yet.
that's fine. What I said is I want to cover that material quickly to start with tonight. Um, the question continues to pop up: which handbook do you follow? The 2014 handbook that you folks started with, or the new fall 2016 handbook? And it's kind of a hybrid. But really and truly, for students in 603, the only difference is you will do a you will submit one proof for the 21 competencies with your clinical coach. In the past, what we did was we would give the principal and the student at our first meeting in 601 a list of suggested activities for their 400-hour internship. And that list, we knew if they completed that list that they would have completed all 21 of those competencies for North Carolina administrators. Um, One of the problems was that it took a long we had to sit down in the fifth semester with the principal and the student had to run through the list of what they had done to meet those 21 competencies. It was quite time consuming and got to where principals were just signing off on it anyway. They would just look at the list of activities and sign off on it. So to kind of simplify and expedite the process, what we've done now, or what Dr. Neal and Dr. Shellman have done, is put that list of competencies in a folio in TaskStream. And if you're in 602 through 605, you simply go in and show them one proof of what you've done. It could be an email, it can be a flyer. It's not a written thing. It's fairly quick and simple, but you only have to do one. Now, students who are starting new this fall have to do that 3 times. You folks only have to do it 1 time. And that's the only substantive change, is rather than sit down with your internship supervisor and principal and go through that list of activities to make sure you hit all 21 of those competencies at the end of the program. See, this speaks to the 400 hours that you do as an intern. It's not really your evidence artifact work. I was asked last night, can I submit things from my evidence artifacts? Sure, things that were generated by doing them. But this competency folio is not about evidence artifacts. It's about your 400 hours. And to make sure that during that 400 hours that you did activities that would lead you to have successfully fulfill the requirements for those 21 competencies. As I said, at one time, we used to sit down with the principal and the student and go over that list to make sure they'd hit them all. Now, you simply submit what they call an evidence or a proof or an artifact that was generated by you doing that competency. And it's fairly simple, but that's the only substantive change. Everything, the schedule that I have on the weekly schedule for evidence turn into TaskStream stays the same. Peer review stays the same. The Zoom reviews stay the same. Everything stays the same. The only substantive change is you will put a proof in TaskStream that you hit all 21 competencies during your 400-hour internship. That's it. What we had started doing recently was putting a place in your TaskStream portfolio to upload your log with the hours. You'll continue to do your log, but this makes sure that you hit all 21 competencies. So that's in a nutshell. So the weekly schedule that I have for the components that are due this semester and the times that they are due, that stays the same. Peer review stays the same. Zoom review stays the same. So you will meet with your clinical coach, and they will talk to you about putting your proof into TaskStream, into that TaskStream folio. So look at that handbook again. I have it again on this page down at the bottom. Just make sure that you look over that new handbook in terms of that folio, putting those putting those competency proofs in there, and that's pretty much it. Let me remind you that there's been some questions. If you have already completed peer reviews, or your work has already been peer reviewed that is due this semester, you don't have to go back and redo those. Just upload those straight into a discussion board, or upload those straight into assignment Dropbox. I don't intend for you to do work a second time. Remember that you do one peer review of each of the 10 components this semester. So pick one of your classmates at random and do one for each of the 10 different components. And then the 2 Zoom peer reviews are of the final, the SCIP and the OMA final. That's again here on the welcome and course introduction on the course overview page. And your Zoom teams again are here at the bottom of the page. And the person who is first in the list is the Zoom master. If you have questions about how to use Zoom, go to the new handbook. It has a really good section on how to use Zoom and how to be the Zoom master. Okay. Jill, any questions? Is that clear as mud?
No, sir, I don't have any questions.
All right. So let's look at where we are. Let's see, new share. Let's look at the weekly schedule and see where we are. We're at week 3, school and the legal environment. Review 1 or more cases and reflect on the impact of schools. Our discussion board this week was a field trip policy. The reason I picked that one, I had that happen to me. I wasn't on the field trip, but I had a bus rear-ended. When I was principal of junior high school, I had a bus rear-ended in it, and it becomes quite a big amount of drama. But the reason why that I picked this particular one, not only because I had that happen, but because generally the new assistant principal on the block is in charge of field trips. That's going to be your responsibility. Just like last week when I talked about you're going to have to walk around with the custodian and do the fire safety inspection and the fire drills. Yeah, that's what you're going to have to do field trips too. That's just, there are certain things that just don't change in this business. And the new AP on the block is going to have to do field trips. You need to know what the policy is and how to handle those things. We had an excellent post this week that talked about this had happened to them, and the principal came out and walked through all the steps and did all the things, or the assistant principal. And I thought, that's what you hope will happen is that your assistant principal that's in charge of this knows the policy, knows to come out if it's local, and knows everybody knows the proper things to do so that the situation doesn't get away from you. Briefly, when I was junior high principal in Charlotte, we had a bus rear-ended in what's called North Charlotte, but it's just the northern part of the city center. It's heavily residential, and car rear-ended a bus. And by the time I got there, thankfully the police were on the scene because there were people who were coming in and parking their cars and claiming that they'd been hit and laying down in the street. It became quite an ordeal. But thankfully, because the people, the AP that I had in charge of that knew to call the police immediately and had instructed the drivers to do so, it went well, but it could have not gone well. And so that's why I have that one this week. So this week, that's why I had you do field trips. Now, I want to talk about, because school and the legal environment, legal cases, I want to talk tonight about kind of the history of the most important legal cases in school law. Again, now it's my opinion, but these are things that I think that every administrator should know and know the implications of. So I'll move to that. And I'll start. These are chronological, and so I'll just work through them. The first case of major significance for public schools in America and North Carolina was Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 that desegregated schools. We really didn't do a lot between 1954 until the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1965. And as a result of the Civil Rights Act of 65 in 1966, North Carolina began integrating schools. So you can see there was a 12-year gap between the law, the Supreme Court case, and anything happening. And I don't know that anything would have happened then if the Civil Rights Act hadn't been passed in '65. So that was a watershed for modern schooling. I consider anything prior to '65 to be the olden days of schooling, and anything after 1965 is the modern era of integration. I was in school in '66 and remember when integration started. As a result of, uh, of school integration, we started to have school consolidation. Um, the old model of a high school on every corner, of black schools and white schools. When we started integrating schools, we found that we had about twice as many schools as we actually needed. And so we started consolidating schools. And we also, about that time, understood that there was an economy of scale. That point was driven home because in 1966, North Carolina exited capital funding and made it a local responsibility for capital funding of schools. Now, capital funding, as we'll learn later this semester, is buildings, grounds, and technology and things inside of the building. The actual physical part of the school is capital. And North Carolina got out of that in '66 and left it to the locals. And what they figured out very quickly is they couldn't have a dozen schools with 200 kids in them. They needed four uh, with 600 in them. That there was an economy of scale. And so that also, not only did integration drive school consolidation in North Carolina, um, when the state got out of capital funding and it became a responsibility of the local taxpayers, the local tax base to fund schools, they decided they didn't need near as many schools. Now, when we talk about what funds schools, it's local property tax from both homeowners and businesses. That's where the local gets their money. Now, in North Carolina, we have unempowered school boards. We have 114 school districts, public school districts in North Carolina. There's one in each of the 100 counties, and there are 14 city school districts, like Moore's, near where my home is here, where I am tonight. The next county up, I can see across the water, is Iredell, Statesville. They have a school district there for the county, but also Mooresville City has a city school district. But regardless of whether it's the 100 county school districts or the 14 city school districts, their school boards are unempowered. What that means is they can't levy taxes and pay for schools. Those school boards propose a budget every year and then submit that budget in the county schools to the county commissioners and the city school districts to the city commissioners. And so those people give schools money along with other public services like fire, police, and rescue, and other services for the county. So that's where the money comes from. And so once the state got out of funding capital, it became a squeeze for locals to pay for local districts to pay for schools. And so I think that drove consolidation actually more than desegregation did. I think it was in North Carolina. I think it was more of the money drove that, but it aided in desegregation because we had consolidation. Also, at that time in '65, we had the Elementary and Secondary Acts, Titles 1 through 9. Now, those of you in the school business know what Title 1 is. That's reading and math support for economically disadvantaged children. And you know what Title 9 is. That's gender equity. There's other titles in between, and I could spend all night on those. Make sure that you know what all those titles are. That's in the reading. But that's when those came about, was in '65. Continuing on our timeline, and I'm going to cover this in the second document that I covered tonight. Tinker versus Des Moines Board of Education in 1969 in Iowa was a watershed moment. It was about the flag and those kinds of things during the Vietnam War. But what came out of that was significant for public schools is that students now had due process rights, that they had that you had to provide them substantive and procedural due process rights where they had the right to face their accuser, the right to give their side of the story, that they were protected against arbitrary and capricious decisions. All of those rights came to them uh, as any citizen would have in the United States of America. And I'll cover that more, as I said, in the second document tonight. But that was a watershed moment in how we do business in schools. Again, this is the modern era of schooling. You can't just punish kids in a vacuum anymore. And you can't just decide on your own what you want to do with them. This led to the development of district code of conduct, of school-wide disciplinary procedures. That's where that all came from, was after due process rights were given to students by the Supreme Court in 1969. Very much changed the face of how school and administrators operate on a daily basis. Moving on down the line, the Swan decision was a national decision. It happened to happen in Charlotte, here in Charlotte, but it was a national decision, and it was that said that busing had to be used to integrate schools, that you couldn't just do neighborhood schools and allow schools to naturally stay segregated, that you had to use busing to desegregate schools. And that happened in 1971. Julius Chambers, many of you North Carolinians know who Julius Chambers is. He retired as president of North Carolina Central, but he was a famous lawyer in North Carolina. And he argued that case in front of the Supreme Court. Then we had the Education Amendments of 1972 that ratified Titles 1 through 9, that affirmed those. There was some backlash about those, but those were affirmed in 1972. Continuing on our timeline, another Supreme Court decision that greatly, and law that was passed as a result that greatly changed the face of public education was in 1974, Public Law 94-142, which brought about federal funding and rights for special education children. Prior to 1974, most special needs children did not come to public school. They were homeschooled, if you would call it that. They just weren't in public school. You might have a few here or there, and unfortunately, mostly what they did was custodial work in the school. I remember that clearly from my time in school, because I'm after that time in public school. We just didn't have special ed kids in school with us, and if they did, they just basically worked with the janitor each day. Very sad situation. So this semester, as you're working on the OMA, you will delve into special education and what those students are required to be given and what they get, and you'll look in OMAC to see if they're getting those things. And you'll also look at other special populations. Title I students, your intervention kids, your English as second language students, your academically gifted, all of those fall under that umbrella. In 1975, there was a landmark Supreme Court decision. People had been fighting again, the Elementary and Secondary Act of '65. Folks were ignoring it, just as they had ignored Brown until the Civil Rights Act 11 years later. Folks were ignoring the Elementary and Secondary Acts of '65, and so 10 years later, the Supreme Court upheld all the acts from 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Acts. That was Robinson versus Cahill, that said, yes, you will have to do these things. In North Carolina, in 1984, the North Carolina Basic Education Plan was passed. As a result, we started a career development program where you had status 1, 2, and 3. It was our first attempt statewide to differentiate pay for teaching performance. It was our first attempt at a pay for performance plan. It crashed and burned, not because it wasn't working, but because the General Assembly refused to fund it. But we did try that. I worked both in one of the 14 state pilots. I worked as a principal in Burke County, and that had the career development program. And I also, when I came to Charlotte-Mecklenburg was a local pilot. And but we have tried in the past to differentiate teacher pay by performance. There is no problem in doing that. I support that. It's not hard to do. It just costs more money, and that's why we don't do it. We've talked about it again. It's been a hot topic, especially the last 5 years again. But when folks find out that it costs more money, then they tend to jump back away from that. What was perhaps more significant from the North Carolina Basic Education Plan of 1984 was the standard course of study. For the first time, and of course, it wasn't fully implemented until 1989. The implementation began in 85. But by 1989, North Carolina, all public schools in North Carolina had a standard course of study. Those of you who are old enough will remember that when you first began teaching, they gave you a white notebook, and it was your standard course of study. And it had standards, goals, objectives, all those things in it, and it told you the content that you were to teach. That's for the first time ever in North Carolina, we had a standardized curriculum. That stayed in place until Common Core came along a couple of years ago. So it had a good run. You had, by grade level and by course in high school, you had a standard course of study. In 1989, as a result of the North Carolina Basic Ed Plan, which said every child gets a basic education, and once we got the standardized curriculum in, the standard course of study, then we could at that time begin to start to measure whether the students were getting that basic education or not. It took 5 years to get everything up and running and get the curriculum standardized and get it out in schools. And then in 1989, the state began what was called PBAP, or Performance-Based Accountability Program. It eventually became the state ABC program, as you know it. But when it first started, it was PBAP. I was a principal at that time. It started the state report card and integrated into course testing. The law said every child gets a basic education. Well, you had to be able to measure that, and that's what the accountability program was for, was to measure whether or not students were getting that basic education that the state promised them. And again, that brought about end-of-grade testing, grades 3 through 8, and end-of-course testing in grades 9 through 12. All right. Well, as a result of the state report card and testing and finding out that a lot of more rural, poorer districts were not doing very well in state testing, a lawsuit was launched in 1994, called the Leandro case. Many of us felt like that it was going to substantively change how funding is done to public schools in North Carolina from the state. North Carolina has a modified accrual accounting system, but we have what's called a flat rate funding formula, where every student brings in a certain amount of money from the state in every district across the state, and it's the same in Mecklenburg as it is for my buddy Todd, superintendent in Madison. Now, the Andro lawsuit said there is a problem. I'm going to use some round numbers now. Let's say that the state was funding each pupil across the state at $6,000. You know, the per pupil expenditure in North Carolina, let's say it's an even $6,000 a year. Well, students in Madison County They were only getting the 6,000 because it's a low wealth county. The county was, because they were having to provide their own capital, their buildings, they weren't able to put anything else into their per pupil funding for the actual school in terms of supplies or materials or extra teachers or any of those things. Students were only getting $6,000 a year. Remember, the state got out of the funding the building business, and low wealth and everybody, low and high wealth districts had to fund their own buildings and the maintenance and upkeep of those buildings. And so low wealth districts could not put any more money into the per pupil expenditures. So their students were getting a straight $6,000. Now, in districts like Charlotte-Mecklenburg, a high wealth district, not only were they funding their buildings, they were spending another $3,000 per pupil, having extra teachers, locally paid teachers, supplies, materials, consumables, instructional materials, textbooks. And so the low wealth districts banded together and filed a lawsuit, the Leandro case, and said, look, we need a district power equalizing formula. So if we're low wealth, we get 7,000 from the state, and Charlotte-Mecklenburg only gets 5,000 per pupil, so that we both end up with the same, and they're willing to put 3,000, so we both end up spending the same per pupil. That did not happen. The Leandro case was decided against the low wealth districts. The funding formula is still the same in North Carolina. Every district, whether you're wealthy or a poor district, you get the same amount of funding per pupil from the state. Now, what did happen as a result of Leandro was the court said that the state needed to do something to try to generate more money for low wealth districts, not in a line item budget in terms of not per pupil, but one-time bequeaths or one-time gifts to low wealth districts to help them, generally in the form of a capital improvement. For example, up in Surrey County, they got a cafeteria. So where did that money come from? That was the birth of the North Carolina Education Lottery. So here's a trivia question for you for next time you're with your friends. How did the North Carolina Education Lottery come about? It came about because the low wealth districts in the Leandro case lost their case. State funding formula per pupil was not changed, but the lottery was started to generate some money that could be bequeathed to districts on a case-by-case basis to help them fund projects in their district. And so that's how Surrey got their cafeteria. You probably have heard some, lottery money. It's not, you don't get it every year. You don't get it per pupil. You get bequeaths, I guess. Or I guess it's pork barrel. They got one in Ireland Statesville to start a little technology program that was in cooperation with the NASCAR Institute. Just general things like that. Most of the lottery money, there's a few student scholarships, but in general, it has not, the lottery in general has not been successful in equalizing the disparity between low and high wealth districts across North Carolina. But there has been some small projects that have been beneficial to low wealth districts, but that's where the lottery came from. In 2001, exactly 30 years after Swan, there was a lawsuit in Charlotte. It had to be in Charlotte because that's where the original case, the Swan case, was. It was a Capuchon lawsuit. Basically, it stopped the Swan decision after 30 years, no more busing. But what was significant about that lawsuit, and the finding in that lawsuit said there would be no more busing for desegregation, and more importantly, if schools resegregated, the school district or the state was not obligated to go back and remedy that. And so what we have seen, of course, in the 15 years since that time is schools have resegregated to the same levels that they were prior to the Swan decision in Charlotte and across the state of North Carolina. and there is no remedy for that, and that is creating, again, disparities between schools and between districts, and is creating tremendous pockets of poverty and low performing schools. But there is no obligation to remedy that. I think that is a shame. But again, uh, that's how it is. Back to the national scene in 2001, No Child Left Behind was passed. It said no child had to go to a low performing school, or no child had to go to a persistently dangerous school. We know what low performing is. That's if less than half your kids are progressing. Persistently dangerous is if you have uh, more than one act of crime of violence. Excuse me, of violence. There are acts of crime and violence. We'll go over that in just a minute in the second document tonight. But we have 16 acts of crime and violence. The 9 acts of violence, if you have more than one of those for every 200 kids in your building per year, or 5 for 1,000, you are declared on the persistently dangerous watch list. The state monitors you, comes out and does an audit, looks at your data. The district has to put a program in place to try to help you. And if you continue to be persistently dangerous, if you continue, at that time, it's the same as if you're low performing. Either you have to reconstitute the school, or students are all allowed to transfer to a non persistently dangerous school. I worked in Charlotte, Mecklenburg the last 20 years or so of my career. One of in my purview that I was responsible for when I was in central office was trying to keep those schools, to get them off the persistently dangerous list, or that they didn't get declared persistently dangerous. We did have a school that we had 2 that were declared persistently dangerous just prior to me taking this over, and both of those were such disasters. We vowed to never do that again, and so we unfortunately at one point made a decision to allow students to transfer, and they picked a school all the way across the district, and that was quite a disaster. And then we had one where we reconstituted, and that was a disaster too, because we couldn't get anybody else to go there and work. So the penalties for low performing, they're the same for persistently dangerous. Probably you didn't know that. That's one of those things that a lot of teacher level folks don't know, that one's in there. We started out, our testing program was a comparative testing model that compared rich and poor, black, white, very, very unequitable. We're now moving into a growth model where students are compared against themselves in the EBOS model. But that was, the door to that was opened by No Child Left Behind. Most significantly also, No Child Left Behind said every state had to put in place a program to promote teacher retention. In North Carolina, it's called a Teacher Working Conditions Survey. If you ever wondered where that came from, it's not that the state cares about how you feel about your job as a teacher or wants to make it better. They're required by federal law to have a program in place to work toward teacher retention. And so North Carolina selected the Teacher Working Conditions Survey. It's obviously not important enough to do it every year. We only do it every other year. That's why when I said they're not really interested, if they were interested, it seems to me that we'd be doing that every year, but we do it every other year. But that's where the Teacher Working Conditions Survey came from. It's not out of the goodness of the state's heart. It's mandated by No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind also said that every child had to have a highly qualified teacher, and that speaks obviously to certification. Now, my understanding is if you go to a college of education and get a degree and do your student teaching and pass the praxis, you are a highly qualified teacher. However, if you don't do any of those 3 things, you are not highly qualified. And so that has brought about problems for us in North Carolina in terms of taking lateral entries and Teach for America. Those people are not highly qualified. It also, No Child Left Behind said that children that had to have certified teachers in the area in which they were teaching. That's been particularly difficult in middle schools. where you have the teaming concept, and you might have a teacher teach math and science, and many times they wouldn't be certified in both. So that has brought about some changes and some challenges for administrators. And when you're doing your master schedule this semester, that's one of those things that and when you're looking at master schedules, that's one of those things that you have to take into consideration. Is everybody highly qualified? Do I have lateral entries that aren't? If I'm trying to team in the middle school, will that teacher be teaching out of field if I have them teach more than one subject? So all of those issues arose from No Child Left Behind. In 2010, we began across the nation doing value added. In North Carolina, we selected the SAS Institute out of the Research Triangle, and they developed a program called EVOS. Eventually, our goal in North Carolina is get to 50-50, where a teacher's performance evaluation is based half on whether their 85% of their students make growth that year, and the other half on their actual teacher evaluations and walkthroughs. We aren't there yet. I think we're still, in some districts have moved more, but I think maybe 80-20 across the state. 80% is on your evaluations, 20% on your student performance. This has opened back up the door again. That issue that came in from accountability from PBAP, the state ABCs, from the basic ed plan. We're back there again about paper performance. Now, we know how to do paper performance. I mean, do 85% of your kids make growth every year? But the problem with that is how do we pay for that? And so one of the things that the state has done, they've added $5,000 on the beginning salaries, but they've cut $25,000 off the back end, or $25,000 off the back end. So teachers now max out at about $50,000 after 20 years and stay at that same level for the last 10 years of their career. They no longer continue to make and go up into the 70s like they one time could. Supposedly that was in an effort to be able to take that money and put it into a paper performance scheme. That is yet to be realized. Right now, by adding 5 to the beginning and cutting 25 off the back, the state has reduced their personnel costs by about 30%. That money is supposed to go into paper performance, but we'll see. And of course, I've already mentioned the lottery is about pre-K scholarships, low wealth, one-time gifts of money. That also factors into that too, in terms of there is talk about using lottery money to pay for performance. But as you can see, I've listed, we're using it already to pay for scholarships, low wealth bequeaths, pre-K, and some other things. And the lottery itself, I think about 40% of the money has to go to pay out the winners. And so I don't see how we're going to find money from the lottery to pay for performance. We're going to have to go back to that 30% that was cut out of the top part of the salary scale and see that funneled back in if we're going to pay for performance. But we'll see if that happens. In 2013 and 14, the state began experimenting with vouchers, about $3,500 given to parents to take their kids to private schools. It's not widespread, but there has been some of that. Charter schools continued to expand. Those are public schools, but they're run as private schools. We also saw, in order to cut back on that 30% that I was talking about, we reduced our overhead costs for personnel, elimination of master's pay. Folks were grandfathered in, but eliminated master's pay, and the elimination of career status. Now, career status is not about tenure and about protecting bad teachers. Career status is a property right. Without career status, the idea is to begin to differentiate pay for certified teachers as we do in charter schools. So if you're a math teacher and you're in high demand, we'll pay you your full salary and benefits. But if you're a PE teacher, we would love the opportunity to, or it seems to me that folks would love the opportunity to pay them as a long-term sub and give them no benefits. That's next on the horizon, I'm afraid. If we career status is not completely gone yet. There's still some battles to be fought, but the day that career status eventually is completely eliminated and the court case is heard and decided upon, and of course it may take, as you can see from some of the earlier ones here, it usually takes 8 or 9, sometimes anywhere from 4 to 10 years to decide these things. But if career status is eventually completely eliminated and all the court challenges are quelled, what I think you'll see immediately happen is there'll be a differentiation. Certain positions will only pay long-term sub pay and will have no benefits that are certified teaching positions, much as what happens in charter schools now. And that will, again, be a big saving in terms of personnel costs. Jill, it's just you and me. Is that, you understand those things I just covered? Any of that make sense to you? Any of it ring a bell?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Definitely. Did you know all this stuff already?
I didn't know all of it, but aware of a good bit.
Mm-hmm. Is there
I'm
anything
not from North Carolina, so like I didn't realize the one actually came from North Carolina. I didn't realize that happened.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you can think of that I've missed here that you think is significant over the course of your career or in education that I've overlooked?
No, I think you've hit them all.
Okay. I think these are the things that, as I said, that influence modern schooling. There's a lot of stuff that happened prior to 54, but they're not relevant anymore today.
Right.
These are the things, the modern era of schooling, as I said, started in 54. These are all the things that are relevant to the modern era of school. All right. Moving right along to my second document tonight. I have a top 10 for administrators in terms of legal things, legal issues that you need to be most aware of. Let me cover those for you quickly tonight. I've covered most of this, but no child left behind. You know about low performing in terms of academics. But what most teacher level folks don't know is there's also a statute that's just exactly the same as the other side of the aisle, as we call it, that says you get 5 persistently dangerous incidents, that's acts of violence per 1,000 students, or 1 per 200. And here are the acts of crime and violence. The ones that have the asterisk next to them are acts of violence, and they count against your total. You know that all acts, every incident that occurs in public school must be reported to DPI in the form of Power School, but all violations of the law must be reported to law enforcement. So even though it's self-report, if they catch you not reporting, you'll lose your job. And we'll go over that later when we cover that manual. So here are the things that are the acts of crime and violence. Again, the ones with asterisks count against your calculation for persistently dangerous. Assault with injury, assault with a weapon, assault on school personnel, bomb threat, burning of a school building, death, kidnapping, alcoholic beverages, controlled substance, firearms, weapons of other types, rape, robbery with a weapon, sexual assault, sexual offense, and indecent liberties with a minor. Those are the things that count, that are your acts of crime and violence. Those are calculated, and then out of those are pulled out your acts of violence. Those are with the asterisk, and those are the ones that count against your persistently dangerous total. This is all in the North Carolina Disciplinary Data Reporting Manual, that we will cover in one of our later sessions. And so I just want to introduce that to you tonight. I will go deeper into depth. There are explicit, embarrassing, even definitions of all of these 16, especially the sexual ones. So there shouldn't be, we don't report outcomes into the police or to power school. We report incidents. Now, what that means is I've had principals say, well, I didn't report that gun because I didn't suspend the kid. Suspension is an outcome. Having the gun is an incident. We report all incidents, and the handbook clearly states we report incidents. And so I've had folks who have tried to get around these laws. They no longer work in the district because this is, as I would tell principals and assistant principals, this is about your job. Um, we'll get we get caught, we'll end up in court. You'll go to jail. We'll get fined money, and we'll get thrashed in the Charlotte Observer and all the news stations. We can't, I don't want things to happen. We'll work on preventative measures. We'll work on antecedent behaviors, the little things that become the big things. I hired a criminologist. We'll do everything we can to help you, but you can't just not report it or try to cover it up, because the cover up is always much worse than the crime. It is self-report, but if you don't report, we have to let you go. All right, and that's what number 2 is about. All incidents have to be reported, whether even if it's just disruptive behavior. Everything has to be reported in NCWIS. All acts of crime and violence have to be reported to law enforcement, period. And they're the first call. Just like when you had the wreck on that activity bus, your first call is not back to the school or back to the central office. The first call is to police. And that, if you'll remember, when we looked at duties and responsibilities of the principal last week, it said that all reports go to the law enforcement first, then they go to the superintendent. You tell the superintendent that you made reports to law enforcement, which implies, obviously, that you had to make that call first. One of the things you don't want to get caught doing is looking like you call somebody to try to start the cover up or get advice when you need to call the police, because lives may be at stake. All right, so moving on from that one. This is one that I see this just constantly. I'm just amazed at how many folks can't, school boards, school administrators, superintendents, that just can't catch on to this one. Prayer cannot be staff-led or mandated. Student-led or initiated is legal. But it can't be led by the staff. If kids want to do it, that's fine. If they want to meet the flagpole, that's fine. If whatever they want to do is fine. But you can't mandate it or have your staff lead it. It's just that simple. It's not any harder to understand than that is. But I see all the time all these lawsuits where they sue the school board for prayer-led, student-led, staff-led, and mandated. Those things just can't be done in public school. Contrary to popular opinion, student dress and publications can be regulated to avoid school disruption. Now, I had a case when I was a high school principal in Charlotte a long time ago. Charlotte's kind of the hotbed because of HB2 right now, but I had a young man who dressed as a girl. I sent him home, not because he was wearing a dress, but because all the girls complained that he was able to wear a dress that was shorter than they were able to wear.
Yeah.
True story. So, in my explanation to his parents was, it's fine for him to wear a dress. He's been wearing a dress for years, but now he's taking it a step too far. We don't allow girls to wear dresses that short. He can't wear one that short either. And it was causing a disruption because the girls were angry, and there was conflicts all around school because of that. He had his friend group, and then the girls were angry, and it became a disruption in school. Publications. Yes, you have the right and the duty to the student newspaper, the annual, the yearbook, those kinds of things. You do need to regulate those things. You can be held liable for slander and other things that students do that they think they have First Amendment protection. But there are First Amendment protections, and I do support those. But that doesn't mean that there's not repercussions. So you need to make sure as a school administrator that you understand that you have to regulate publication. Search and seizure. There's a different standard for school personnel than there is for um, law enforcement personnel. The standard for the school staff is reasonable suspicion. The standard for the police is probable cause. Um, Reasonable suspicion is I don't have to have an eyewitness. Probable cause, you pretty much have to have an eyewitness. Strip searches are not permitted by school personnel. If the police feel the need to do that, that's on them. Number 6, zero tolerance policies are not legal. That means you can't just say, you do this, you get that in terms of punishment. If you fight, you get an automatic 10 days. That's not legal. There always must be that goes against due process and mitigating circumstances. Number 7, any forms of abuse, neglect, or harassment must be reported to school and law enforcement. If a student comes and tells you that they've been harassed or neglected or abused, even at home, you have a duty and responsibility to report that. FERPA, you will read more about that when you look into special education, but that is you can't be giving out information on students or their parents, and it's not just special ed. It's like free and reduced lunch. It's any of those kinds of things. Just like me, I ask you to send me information so I can put out a little directory for our classes. The only thing that will be in the directory will be the city near where you live, the school where you work, your Gardner Webb email address, and your name, which are all public records. Your address or your phone number, those kinds of things would not be published. Same kind of thing for students under FERPA. As I mentioned earlier, due process, that came from Tinker versus Des Moines. There's 2 types. You read about that, substantive and procedural. Substantive is what steps is your district set up in your handbook, your code of conduct to handle discipline in terms of a tier system, a level system. What procedures will you follow? And then procedural, did you follow those? Or did you skip some steps? One of your discussion boards coming up quickly is about a discipline incident, interviewing an AP or a principal about discipline. And one of the things that students always say is they're amazed at how much time something that seems so simple takes to process, because you have to give students due process. And the last that I want to cover tonight is arbitrary and capricious. Arbitrary is when you single students out for punishment. You got 2 kids out back behind the gym smoking. You bring them in, and you give Johnny a warning and send him back to class, and you send Joey home on a suspension. That's illegal. That's arbitrary. You've got a group of 15 kids that are involved in an action. You pick 1 or 2 or 3 of them out and punish them, and the rest of them you let go. You can't do that. So you have to give everybody the same, or you have to work them through the same process. Capricious is when you give more punishment than your handbook allows by your board policy, your code of conduct. Every district has a code of conduct that spells out the range of punishment for infractions. As long as you stay within that range, you're fine. But one of the things that happens from time to time is you give, because a student's been involved in multiple infractions, you give them more than the particular infraction that they just committed. And so the idea is it can't be cumulative. You've seen a kid 5 times this week, and you're fed up with this kid. He's been in the office 5 times this week, and whatever he did this time, the maximum is a 1-day suspension that you can give him, but you give him 5 because he's been there 5 times this week. Can't do that. Every instance stands on its own. So it's capricious to give him more than that, whether he was there 1 time that week or 5 times. Whatever the instant he's there for this time, you can only give him the limit of that punishment. Otherwise, you would be guilty of being capricious. I have a story that goes with that. I see that I've got just about a couple minutes left, and I'll tell my story quickly. I used to do the hearings for major infractions in CMS. I would do those myself when we would have something that we knew was going to get in the media, or would be potentially career threatening for somebody in the central office, I would go out and do it myself. And I did a hearing at a high school, our most affluent high school, for a kid that brought 2 knives to school. He was 18 years old, and he had his own attorney. His parents didn't come with him, and the attorney let him give testimony against himself, which not a good idea. And he admitted that he had the knives and wanted on the record. And then in the closing argument, the attorney, the reason why he had him admit what he did was is that he charged that the school had been capricious, that the handbook said that they could only give him 5 days of out of school suspension, and they'd given him 10. And at that time, I had to point out to the young attorney that he was reading the elementary code of conduct that allowed only 5 days for weapons, but the high school code of conduct for a senior allowed for 10 days. And at that time, he wanted to strike his client's testimony, and he felt like he'd been duped. He just read the wrong handbook. We would have never gotten to a hearing. It would have been a hearing officer before it got to me to go out and do the hearing to make sure that the district was within all the rules and regulations and policies. There is somebody who checks behind all those things, especially in cases that are going to go to court or are going to go to a legal hearing. So you got to make sure you do it right. Some of the smaller districts don't always have people checking behind you, and you go to court, you get embarrassed. So again, arbitrary and capricious. During the due process, make sure that you follow those rules. All right, those are the things that are important tonight for practicing administrators. I've covered for you the legal cases that have shaped modern education since 1954. There are more, but those are the ones that have really driven what's happened since 54. And I've gone over the North Carolina cases that have shaped what public education looks like in North Carolina in the modern era. These are the top 10 things that you need to know and be sure that you're well versed in. As a school administrator, these are the things that can get away from you real fast and get in the media. I used to have students that told me, well, I'm out in the country. We don't have a radio station or a TV station or 3 TV stations or newspapers like Charlotte. But with social media now, the world is a very small place. You can't make some mistakes but one time, and that's the end of it. So these are the things that if you make mistakes on these, it'll become known, and it'll pretty much end your career. So I want to make sure that I covered those for you on the legal issues tonight.
Where did we get this one from?
Pardon?
Where did we get these? Is this on the website?
It is under Zoom session 3.
Okay.
All the documents that I cover each week are on that week's Zoom session. Now, this information here on persistently dangerous will also be in the handbook from DPI that I cover later this semester. Let's look. That's a good question, Luke. Glad to have you tonight. Let me go back, stop share. Okay, share screen. Let me go back to course overview, share. Let me go back here. Let's see where I have that handbook. Let's see. Okay. The materials that I covered tonight are under Zoom session 3. Let's make sure they're there. Yep, there they are. And let's see. The DPI manual that speaks to incident reporting. The CMS incident reporting manual is here that I had made in 2009, and the CMS code of conduct is here. I use these, but every district has similar across the state. So that's the next 2 weeks. Let's see. Here we go. Violence in schools. Let's see, 7. Here we go. Disciplinary data reporting from the state. If you look under 7, there's where the manual is located. That covers persistently dangerous incident reporting, and all that is in the DPI manual. You can also just go to Google and Google NCDPI, North Carolina Department of Public Instruction area, Disciplinary Data Collection Manual. And it has a greater explanation of those things that I covered tonight in terms of acts of crime and violence and incident reporting. We will spend a whole night on that later this semester. But every week when I come on, my job is to try to interpret the things that this week's lesson, what it means to you as a practicing administrator. I will always have the documents available for you under that week's Zoom session. Good question, Luke. All right, I see it's 8 o'clock. My time is up. I've got plenty of time for questions, though. Anybody have any questions on the material that I covered tonight? Again, as a practicing administrator, you're going to be in charge, AP, you're going to be in charge of field trips. That's why the discussion board this week. You're going to be the one processing discipline. That's why I covered acts of crime and violence reporting. And you need to be, you need to understand how all those court cases that you read about this week, how they've influenced the face of modern education. That's why I covered the things I did tonight. You need to be a knowledgeable person. Questions?
I have a question about when you do the peer review.
Yes.
You put in the Dropbox or because
discussion board.
Discussion board.
Yes, you go to the discussion board. That's where you find the ones. You put yours in there to be peer reviewed, and of course others will put theirs there. And once you peer review theirs, you go back to that same thread where they uploaded theirs, and you just upload your peer review there for them.
Okay.
Okay. And then now I don't have in assignment Dropbox. I don't have a place to put peer reviews. The two that I want for me that are going to be graded are the two video ones you do on Zoom. Unfortunately, you can't upload Zoom videos to Blackboard. Okay. You can, but it takes too much space and Gardner Webb will take them off. So I will have you just email me those links and I will grade them, and I can post a grade in Grade Center for you for those. But that's a good. I would love to have a place in assignment Dropbox to put them, but Gardner Webb will scrape them off. They use up too much of their storage. Those videos do. But yes, all peer review work will be done inside of discussion board. You will go in. If you can see my screen, you will go in and you will upload yours, and you will go where other folks upload theirs, and you can download them, and you can put the review back on that same thread.
All right.
Okay. Good question, Luke.
All right.
Thanks for your email today, too, by the way.
Sure, no problem.
All righty. All right. I have only one more folks who haven't given me their personal information. As soon as I get that on this front page here on our course overview, in a box right below where I have the peer assignments, I will post that information right here. And it's just the first, again, I'm just going to post the person's name, the town nearest where they live, so you'll know what part of the state geographically they're in, because you might want to get together. Meet at Panera Bread and have a sandwich or something. I'll put the school where they work and their Gardner Webb email address. That's the only thing. I'm not putting addresses or personal information out there. So as soon as I get the last one, I'll post it right here. All right. Y'all have a good week.
You too.
Questions, email me, call me. There's also a place in discussion board where you can ask questions. Remember, I grade every day. All your work is up to date, should be up to date on grading. And so just keep up with your evidence artifacts and your peer reviews, and you're on your own for your weekly discussion boards. And I will see you all next Thursday. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Sure.
You too.
Good night.
Right. Good night, Jim.
Night.